Protectionism and anti-free trade forces are more popular now than any time since the 1930s. Is this a road bump or a roadblock for free trade? To discuss this and more, Alessandra Galloni of Thomson Reuters is joined now by former Mayor of San Francisco and Managing Director of Thayer Ventures, Mark Farrell, Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs for Cisco Systems, Pastora Valero, and former US Congressman and Chief Judge of the World Trade Organization, James Bacchus.
Hello, everyone. I realize the challenge before us, going after a panel that spoke about dating, sex robots, orgasms, but I promise you that this group can make it just as good in talking about global trade. So the panelists have been introduced, and I think we're going to break up this panel on the forces of protectionism that exist at the moment, the most since the 1930s, into two areas. First of all, it would be remiss of us not to address the election results of overnight from the United States and what this means for President Trump's trade policies and how possibly that could change with the Democrats having the House. And we're fortunate enough, in fact, to have two Democratic politicians or former politicians with us. And then the second part of the panel is going to be about the lack of true global digital trade rules. So basically the rules that would affect most of the companies at this conference. Global trade rules of today were really made for 20th century trade, B2B businesses shipping containers around the world, whereas obviously now e-commerce is on the rise. $30 trillion in value is the e-commerce world. So without further ado, our panelists have been introduced, and I wanted kind of a gut reaction starting from the far right, from Mark, on what does this change from the election last night possibly mean for trade policy from the U.S.?
Sure. So first of all, let me say, full disclosure, I am a Democrat, and so today was a great day for Democrats around the world and in the United States. You can clap. It's okay. I think a lot of people are excited. But, as you think about trade, though, I think, sure, on paper, obviously now trade agreements have to go through both houses of Congress, so Trump is going to have to deal with the Democrats in the House of Representatives. But I would suggest really on two fronts, it's really not going to have that much of an effect. First of all, the way it's structured is that the president is allowed to have unilateral negotiating authority, and Congress approves trade agreements after the fact. And so common sense would say you would co-opt the Democrats and Speaker Pelosi along the way to get their approval, but President Trump has really not shown that type of demeanor in his first 2 years in office, to say the least. And second of all, the presidential election in 2020 started today. And Trump is going to have one of two approaches, and I'm going to tell you which one I think he's going to take. One, you can work with the Democrats in Congress to get things done for the American people, which he should be doing. Or second of all, it's going to be a combative time where he's going to try and distance himself and create that space between Democrats and Republicans. And if he does that, then it's just going to be more battle with the Democrats. And I don't think that the Democratic takeover of the House will really affect his demeanor or, quite frankly, what he's going to do from a trade perspective.
Possibly could harden it even.
It could. It very well could. And look, at the end of the day, again, his demeanor and how he's approached, whether it be foreign policy or foreign trade agreements, I don't see this changing that at all. Again, people might want it to happen. I certainly would like it to happen, to work with the Democrats, but President Trump has not shown the propensity to do that, and I don't think it's going to happen going forward.
Jim, you're a former congressman, a former judge of the WTO, a professor, a trade guru. What do you think, do you share Mark's view that what has just happened doesn't change the situation that much? And then where would you put us at this? Give us a little bit of historical context as to where we are now as opposed to the 1930s and what we could look forward to.
Well, first of all, I agree with all that Mark said. I think there are many positive consequences that are likely from electing a Democratic House of Representatives and returning my friend Nancy Pelosi to the speakership. But I don't see any benefits really in trade. My former colleagues in the House will be forced to choose between whether they oppose trade more or oppose Trump more. And in terms of the Democratic position on trade, I think that perhaps 2 of the 3 remaining free traders in the Democratic Party are on this platform, and we are sworn not to disclose the identity of the 3rd. Having said that, I think we could be looking at some progress on digital trade. Democrats are very much attuned to the various technology industries and understand the value of the free flow of data. Just as we're seeing a rise in protectionism worldwide, led largely by the Trump administration, we're also seeing a rise in protectionism in the new areas of digital trade. And there, the Trump administration has shown a willingness to try to look to something approaching some global rules. As you mentioned at the outset, we have global trade rules dating back 70 years and more, and a World Trade Organization dating back 25 years that include 164 countries and apply to 98% of all world commerce. However, these rules were written just before the creation of the World Wide Web. So we have no real global digital rules on trade. We've been trying to improvise with a lot of digital chapters in free trade agreements and other preferential and regional trade arrangements. We've made progress there. But in terms of increasing the flow of trade and thus of increasing prosperity globally, we need basic global rules. And we're facing now restrictions on the free flow of data in different parts of the world. We're facing forced disclosure of source codes as a condition of market access. We're facing forced localization of the storage of data, and on and on and on. These are digital forms of protectionism. We need rules that can be applied globally to keep these things from happening so we can continue to grow all of these great ideas and innovations that we're seeing here in Lisbon this week.
Pastora, you run public policy and government affairs for a big company, Cisco. What do you see? What is the biggest problem with the restrictions on data flows that you see through your company and your experience in all the countries you deal with here?
Yeah, thank you. And Cisco is a technology company that operates globally in more than 165 countries, and we have really grown based on free, fair trade rules. But to your point, James, I think the digitization that we are seeing, the explosion of devices connected to the internet, the data, unprecedented data, but also the value of this data is just something we've never experienced. Sellers that are becoming exporters on digital platforms, but also any company in any industry, even traditional industries like mining, are using data to make a better product, to be more cost efficient. And so that value of data, which is estimated as 3.5 of GDP, and it's going to be growing exponentially, it's really at risk because we do not have free trade rules that really support the cross-border free flow of data. And so the question is, how do we go about that? Free trade may be one instrument, there may be other instruments. So today, we are experiencing localization of data. We are experiencing some restrictions, sometimes legitimate on privacy and security concerns, but sometimes they are disguised trade restrictions. And I think we have an opportunity on the positive side, despite the challenges on trade wars, to really look at modernizing trade agreements. And in fact, if you look at the renegotiated NAFTA agreement, the USCMA, they do have quite a forward-looking digital chapter, which is not just about e-commerce, but it's also about enabling cross-border data, preventing localization and forced localization, prohibiting disclosure of source code, and also cybersecurity, because cyber threats are global. And I think it's important also to keep in mind that we need to approach cybersecurity threats also in a global manner. So it is an opportunity, and our hope is that more and more countries and regions, even the European Union, as they look in negotiating new trade agreements, they have more forward-looking digital chapters.
I mean, you raised the issue of privacy. I mean, one of the reasons these restrictions exist is because of the problems we have seen in full force over the past year, 2 years. I mean, you know, Mark, there are legitimate privacy issues that have emerged, you know, dare I say it, in the U.S. election process over the past couple of years that are the reason for such restrictions. I mean, where do you think realistically governments can head?
Look, I think every government's going to have a very different approach based upon their electorate. Obviously, their electorate. What we see in Europe is very different than what we're seeing in the U.S. But you know, as you think about free trade and you think about trade agreements, you know, right now I co-founded a venture fund back in 2009. I'm doing that right now, and we invest in young technology companies in the travel space. I mean, many type of companies that are here today at the conference. You know, we're on the side together because, you know, no longer in this world anymore, you know, travel in itself, the area we focus on, is an inherently global sector, if you will. So travel is global by nature. But it is no longer any good. You know, we see a lot of companies represented here at the conference who are from Portugal or from Lisbon. It's no good for a company to just win Portugal, right? You want to win the world. You want to win Europe. You want to be much broader, and it applies to Portugal, it applies to many other jurisdictions. And so you want the companies as an investor, the companies you invest in, to be able to go global. And I think the potential, if you do not have this free trade, if you do not have, you know, all the things that we're talking about here on stage, then you restrict companies being able to go in other jurisdictions and really become global players. And I think that's the real harm. And if you do that, you start to stifle innovation, and that's the backwards approach.
But Jim, I mean, how realistic, though, considering, you know, concerns on privacy that we have seen, and also considering the problem with policing. You know, it's one thing to police at a border, at a physical border. It's another thing to police in the virtual border. You know, you were a former judge of the WTO. I mean, if you know, cases of conflict are much harder to resolve in the digital sphere than in the material sphere.
I think they are, but I think we can find our way through the difficulties to achieve some type of a consensus on rules. Of all the difficult digital trade issues, I think those relating to the protection of personal information, privacy, and also security are by far the most difficult. And there, at this time, it's hard to imagine the leading trading countries in Europe, the United States, and China coming together on one approach. I do think that in the past several years, the viewpoint of the American people on the privacy issue has moved closer to the viewpoint at the grassroots of the European Union. Europe has moved ahead on this issue through regulation. Currently, our Congress is incapable of agreeing on anything, and one consequence of this is that there has been no congressional action on this issue. But in the meantime, we've had so many derivations of personal privacy, so much hacking commercially, so much hacking and disinformation politically, that I think most Americans are willing to see some restrictions for those reasons, and in terms of privacy and security, desire them. The outlier here is China, which is moving in the other direction and, shall we say, moving against personal privacy. I'm flying from here to China tomorrow, where I'll be speaking on some of these issues at a conference on the rule of law in China. Because of my background in the WTO, I get asked to speak on trade, and I oftentimes end up speaking on the relationship between trade and freedom. And this is one of those issues where at the heart of it is freedom. But here, in terms of the Congress, unless our Congress begins to engage in some constructive and affirmative way on this issue, I see the leadership being ceded to the European Union on the part of the free countries of the world.
Mark?
Yeah, well, just to add to that, you know, we talk about Jim, you mentioned the American people are going towards kind of where the EU has gone, and I totally agree with that. I think what's different now, though, is with this presidential administration is going the other way despite where the American people are going. Two examples. One, immediately came into office and started talking about and effectively roll back net neutrality provisions. I mean, which is crazy, I think, to a lot of the people here in this room and at this conference, but also without any fanfare rolled back some protections that President Obama put in place through an act in the Senate, where now companies can sell your search history data without your consent. And so as the people go this way, the government's going this way, and to the point of, I think it's going to be really difficult to get a lot of jurisdictions, let alone these three major jurisdictions, to agree on one common approach at this point.
Yeah. So maybe if I can comment on that. I mean, certainly privacy and security is core, and they go hand in hand. And we, as a company, we for example, we fully embrace the GDPR, the EU General Data Protection Regulation. We're implementing GDPR across the globe, and we think that there has to be, every country or region may have different approaches to privacy, but there has to be some scale. So we need to work on some mutual recognition of privacy regimes that are based on similar principles of scope of the data that needs to be protected, accountability, transparency, that you only use the data for, you know, the purposes that you have. So these are important issues, not yet resolved. I think the EU has set a trend in terms of privacy. That doesn't mean that every law has to mirror the EU law, but there are some basic principles that every privacy regime should look for. And that's going to be essential in order to trust. Because you need to trust that if I send you my data, you're going to treat my data, and you're going to secure my data, and you're going to protect my data. And if that trust is not there, then we're not going to have these transfers.
As much as you can, Pastora, can you tell us which countries are the hardest to work with? Or to work, which countries that you operate in are the hardest to work in?
Oh, it's a little tricky. I mean,
as much as you can say.
Right. I mean, we do. If we talk about restrictions, I think we have countries like Russia that have very, very strict localization laws. We have countries like India that are also enacting very restrictive laws in terms of localization. Vietnam, Indonesia. I mean, we do. When we are a global company with our scale, we will adapt to whatever legislation, whatever law. It's going to be burdensome. It's going to add cost. But I think the issue here is, how is the digital economy going to grow? How are small and medium enterprises going to be growing and scaling as more and more restrictions are enacted instead of having digital trade facilitated? So it's going to be a headache, but we'll figure it out. Mm-hmm. But the question is, what are the barriers that we are enacting for the future digital companies?
I mean, you're a huge company. You mentioned costs. I mean, what about some of the small companies, you know, that you invest in? I mean, it's a whole other scale of difficulty. So what, you know, if you were lobbying, hypothetically, the U.S. government, hypothetically, on behalf of the companies that you invest in, what would you say are the three most important, you know, free trade concepts in the digital sphere that they would need to push for?
You know, I don't know that I have three that I talk about off the top of my head, but I think more than it's this common theme here is we have to keep our borders open, if you will, from a trade perspective, and allow companies, if we think about innovation, we think about technology that's here to stay, and it's going to continue to transform our world, the more countries that have restrictive policies, whether it be through electronic, or digitization issues around trade agreements or what have you, the more that you have that type of protectionism, the less that country is going to be part of the technology movement that's going on that's transforming the world. And we have companies that we've invested in that will specifically not go into certain countries because of these types of restrictions. As investors, certainly we lose out and the company loses out, but I think ultimately that country then loses out of being part of a revolution, a technology revolution that the rest of the world is partaking in. So, it's less about lobbying the U.S. government. I got plenty of things I'd like to lobby them about, in particular, put back net neutrality in there, because I think without that, we are actually starting to stifle ourselves as a country, and we will going forward. But regardless, from a global perspective, we want innovation to flourish globally, not just at a local level.
So in the last 2 minutes that we have, perhaps I could ask sort of kind of top tips from all of you, because obviously the room and the conference is full of small companies that are dealing with these sorts of things. So Jim, put yourself on the other side, not on the judge side, not on the WTO side, but on the SME side. What a company that is starting now, that is, has a short life and hopes to expand, but wants to globalize, what should they do?
Well, we're looking at this issue in the WTO now with a focus on small and medium-sized enterprises, and especially those that are owned by women worldwide. And one of the things we've found is that the best way for these small and medium-sized companies, especially in developing countries, to prosper is by piggybacking on companies like hers. Multinational firms that are working and producing globally and that have extended supply chains globally. Unfortunately, the president of my country is currently trying to unravel supply chains and thus undo a lot of the mutual comparative advantage that we've prospered from having in the world marketplace over the past generation. We need to oppose that. And lastly, I'd say that there's a moratorium currently in the WTO on the taxation of internet commerce. This must be maintained.
And taken advantage of.
Yes, absolutely.
Pastora?
Yeah, I think our approach more and more with startups and SMEs is really how do we partner together? We need partnerships across the board. And even how do we co-innovate together and put our platform at the disposals of all of these innovations?
Actually, you can go longer because I saw that we actually have more than a few seconds left.
And I think when we think about also legislation, I think we need to keep in mind that SMEs are the backbone of our economies. And as I said earlier, big companies can maybe comply more easily, and we do have the resources, but SMEs can't. And so it's important that we keep that in mind in any legislation, in any regulation. How do we make it easier? How do we make it more simple as we protect what we need to protect in order to comply with the legislation?
But can you just be a little more specific on that then for that?
Well, even GDPR. GDPR, when GDPR was adopted, there were many SMEs that didn't understand what they needed to do. And I think the European Commission has done an effort to address and explain and simplify and reach out to the SME community so that they know what they need to do.
And did you say before that Cisco introduced GDPR outside worldwide?
We are working at GDPR, right, to globalize it. We're currently working on that.
Are you getting pushback from certain countries that don't naturally have to comply?
Well, even in countries that they don't have privacy, absolutely, yes.
It's interesting. Mark?
Look, in terms of tips for companies here, I would say, first of all, be smart about the regulations that you face, not only in your own country, but where you want to go and expand globally. And then truly, this backs up on this political conversation, find your voice. Be part of organizations, be part of conferences like this. But, whatever government, you're under the jurisdiction of, and whether it's a democracy, that's what elected officials are there for. And get together and make your voices be heard. Because unless we, as a community that's here today, and in Lisbon with this conference. Unless we come together on these issues, our voices are going to be drowned out. And so the collective voice of everybody that's here today on issues that matter to all of us is what's going to really change the world for these companies.
Jim, I know you wanted to add something, and when you add it, also, can you give us a sense of when realistically the WTO rules are going to come into the 21st century? I mean, looking kind of practically, when we might have global rules such as the ones, that you've been discussing?
About half of the WTO members have agreed to begin negotiations on global digital rules. They are doing so on their own and not with the official endorsement of the WTO. However, they're being serviced by the secretariat that works for the WTO. Thus, you see the sensitivity of the issue. I think it will take at least 2 years before we see any firm results. In the meantime, you should pay attention to the issue of national security as it plays out in the WTO dealing with trade in goods. For a variety of specious reasons, President Trump has imposed all kinds of illegal unilateral trade restrictions in the form of tariffs against many countries in the world. He is claiming a national security defense. If he is given a national security defense for these actions, then anything goes in terms of trade and goods. It will be a Pandora's box, proverbially, in terms of multiplying these exceptions worldwide. And there will be a spillover into digital trade, because if he prevails in arguing a national security exception on these types of commonplace goods transactions, then I think you can see other countries that are interested in, shall we say, 24/7 oversight of their individual citizens, using these same rulings to support their autocratic actions. All of these things are connected legally in terms of the global framework of rules we have put in place.
Got it. We have 30 seconds. If anybody wants to make a last remark, they can. And if not, the conference organizers will be very happy that we've given them 20 seconds back. I wish I could open this up to the crowd, because I think there could be some interesting questions, but alas, I don't think that's possible with the minutes that we had. Well, thank you to the panelists. I hope we made it a little sexy as we're moving towards the sexiness of sex robots. And thank you very much.